Hey everybody, I'm Cliff N4CCB. In this video, I'm going to talk about working split. Now, what the heck is that? Why would I need to do that? When would I do that? How do I do that? I'm going to tell you all of that. I'm going to give you an example. I'm also going to show you how to work split on these three different radios. Now, these three radios all do it a little differently, so that's why I'm going to do three. But these are very popular radios, and I'll show you how to do it. Let's dig into it. So first of all, working split simply means listening on one frequency and transmitting on another frequency. Okay, now why is that necessary? Well, let's say that you're on vacation. You've taken a radio to the Caribbean, and therefore you're kind of in a desirable location. So you call CQ, and a station answers. And then after you wrap it up with them, maybe a couple of stations answer, throw out their call sign for you. And before you know it, you've generated a pileup. Now, a pileup is a group of people who are all throwing their call sign out at one time, and it becomes chaos. You know, you wrap it up with a station, and all of a sudden you're hearing 10, 15 people all saying their call signs at once. And it's hard to pick out the call signs when they're all jumbled together like that. And what's worse is if you can't pick out a call sign, then people start saying their call signs again. And so there's this long interval where you're trying to pick out call signs. So at that point, it becomes pretty frustrating for you and for the people who are calling. And at that point, you're going to want to work split. All right, so what does that do for you? Well, by working split, you're going to move the people who are trying to talk to you off of your frequency. That way, everybody will be able to hear you clearly because there'll be nobody interfering with you. And then by moving those people off of your frequency onto another frequency, you now can spread them out. So you're not going to move them to a frequency, you're going to move them to a range of frequencies. So you may be listening from here to here, and by making a contact and then turning your VFO knob, you cause everybody not to just try to stay on that same frequency on top of each other. You cause them to be able to spread out, which makes it easier for you and which makes it more efficient. So let's talk about preparing in advance. Let's say that you are going to generate a pileup and you know it. Well, before you do that, you might want to try to pick a frequency to call CQ on where you don't hear any activity 5, 10K above it in the case of sideband. If it's Morse code, you might just want to pick a frequency where there's no activity within the next 2 or 3 kilohertz up. Usually people who work DX are listening up above where they're transmitting. Doesn't have to be that way. As a matter of fact, you can listen down. You can just say up, which implies that you're listening up. Sideband about 5K up, Morse code about 1K up. But that also implies that you're listening above that also. So like I said, you don't just listen to frequencies, to all the people calling on one frequency. You're going to try to spread them out a little bit. So it's smart to go ahead and get to know your radio, learn how to work split, both from the DX perspective and from the people who are chasing DX, the people in the pileups. So that way you'll be confident when the time comes, and you'll also be a good operator. You won't be trying to transmit on the caller's frequency. Now, if you try to do that, you're going to find the frequency police. How do you know if the other station's working split? Well, there's a few ways. First of all, you might just hear them saying up 5 or up. And so you'll know that when they give their call sign and say up, they're listening up above that. So you're not going to be transmitting on their frequency. You're going to be transmitting above that so they can hear you because that's where they're listening. You might also be listening and not hear any other stations. You can hear them working stations, but you can't hear any of the stations they're talking to. Well, sometimes this happens on just regular conversations, right? You only hear one side of the conversation. So that's not uncommon. But if you hear the station working a number of stations rapidly and you don't hear any of them, chances are pretty good that they're working split. Hopefully they're telling you up after each conversation or frequently. But sometimes there's so many people calling that they just work station after station after station without bothering to say that they're listening up. The third way you'll know if they're working split is because somebody who's not paying attention calls on that frequency that they're calling CQ on. And invariably, 1 or 2 people will go down to that frequency and say something to that calling station. Sometimes they say things that aren't very nice. But anyway, if you hear that, then you know they're working split because the frequency police have come there to try to move those people off of that frequency. I don't ever do that, by the way. If somebody's calling that station and that station is not responding to them, they're going to figure out that they're listening on a different frequency. But anyway, there are people who feel obligated to do that, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but it'd be better if we just didn't do that, in my opinion. All right, so in general, how do you work split? Well, in general, most radios have two VFOs, VFO A and VFO B. And so we're going to want to set one VFO to the frequency where we're going to transmit and set the other VFO to the frequency where we're going to listen. And if you're the DX station, you're going to change that listening frequency. You're going to vary that between contacts so that everybody doesn't just gang up on that same frequency. You're going to spread them out. It's really important that you don't transmit on that frequency. Now, for radios that have two VFOs and allow you to swap between them, you can change which ones transmit, which ones receive. Make sure you're not transmitting on the receive frequency. So I'll talk about that when I show you the examples of the radios. So that leads me to an example. I'm going to talk about a concrete example specifying some frequencies here with a diagram that I've drawn. In this example, you're going to be a DX station and you're working people using a microphone on the 20 meter band at 14.330 megahertz. Now pretty soon too many people start to respond when you're calling CQ, so you make the decision to work split. The first thing you're going to do is check up the band to see if the space above you is empty. Often you're going to do this in advance if you think you're going to generate a pileup, but you still need to check it because somebody might have started using the frequency since the time you checked it. Now you come back to your frequency and you're going to call CQ and you're going to say up or up 5 or up 5 to 10 or up and then give a frequency range. In this case, you could say I'm listening up from 14.335 to 14.340. A good DX operator is not going to sit on a frequency, but he's going to turn his VFO after each contact. That way he's working his way through that frequency range and it keeps the station spread out and makes it easier for the DX station to hear the individuals in the pileup. People in the pileup need to set up their radios to work split, listening on the original frequency, which in this case is 14.330, but transmitting somewhere between 14.335 and 14.340, which is where the DX station is listening. Smart operators in the pileup will be looking for a pattern. Maybe the DX station is tuning up a little bit after each contact, and so a smart operator will see that pattern and they'll set their transmit VFO slightly above the last station he worked in order maybe to snag that DX call on his next over. Now, radios with waterfall displays make it really easy to see the frequency where the DX station is working the pileup, and by doing that it makes it really easy to set your VFO to transmit where the station just works somebody else or just above where you just worked somebody else. So it's very handy. Okay, so that's the example, and now we're going to talk about these three radios. Now, I chose these three because each of these three handles working split a little differently. In this case, the KX1 only has one VFO. So the only way to work split is to engage the RIT control and change the frequency from the transmit frequency that way. The KX3 can only transmit on VFO B. So when you go into split, you got to have the transmit frequency set to VFO B. The FT817 can transmit on A or B, and you can just swap between those. And you need to make sure that you're not transmitting on the wrong VFO, and I'll tell you an easy way to tell that. So let's dig into these one at a time, and we'll do it. As I said, the Elecraft KX1 only has one VFO, so we're going to have to use the RIT control to work split. Now, if we're the DX station, we're going to send QRX or the ProSign AS to pause, tell everybody to stand by. We'll take note of our current frequency. We're going to tune up about 1 kilohertz, ask if the frequency is in use. Hopefully it's not. If it's all clear, we're going to come back to the original frequency, and then we're going to use RIT to tune up about 1K above us. We're then going to announce to everybody that we're listening up. Now, that's how you handle that. Now, if you're on the other side of that, if you're chasing DX, if you're part of the pileup, we're going to have to move the VFO up to the pileup and then use RIT to listen down to the DX station. So the way to do that is we're going to use the VFO to find a place in the pileup where we want to transmit. We're going to be transmitting on that frequency. Now we're going to engage RIT and we're going to turn RIT down, or it could be turning it up, but usually turning it down to where we can hear the DX station. All right, that takes care of the Elecraft KX1. On the KX3 in split mode, the radio always transmits on VFO B. So we're going to be listening on VFO A and transmitting on VFO B. So if we're the DX station, our goal is to set the VFO B to our current frequency where everybody's listening to us, And then we're going to set VFO A to where we want to listen for the calling stations. When we're on the original transmit frequency, we're going to push VFO A, the greater than VFO B. We're going to push that button twice to set VFO B to the same mode, frequency, and filter settings as VFO A. Now we're going to press and hold the split button to enter split mode, and at this moment, now VFO B is going to be used for transmission. Using the big knob to raise VFO A, we're going to put it where we want to start listening. We're going to leave VFO B alone, and we're going to use VFO A to raise to the frequency where we expect to hear callers, and then after we work each caller, we're going to move the big knob up or down, depending on how we're varying our frequency while we're working these stations in the pileup. All right, on the other side of this, if we're chasing DX, if we're part of the pileup, our goal is to leave VFO A on the DX frequency because that's where we're going to be listening to him. And we're going to set VFO B to where the DX station's listening. So when we're listening to the DX station on VFO A, we're going to push that VFO A greater than VFO B button twice. Again, we're going to try to set VFO B here to the same mode, frequency, and filter settings as A. Now, we've done that. We're listening to VFO A, and that's where our calling station is. We're going to use the small VFO B knob to raise the frequency to where we want to transmit. We're going to press and hold the split button to enter split mode. So now we're listening to A, but we're transmitting on B. Now, we can press and hold the REV button, the reverse button, to temporarily swap A with B. So while we're holding that reverse button down, we're going to be hearing the people talking on B so that we can adjust our frequency where we're going to be transmitting to try to go somewhere where we think that the DX station is listening. As soon as you let go of the reverse button, it swaps back so that you're listening on VFO A again. One cool thing about the KX3 is that it's got this feature called Dual Watch. And the Dual Watch feature lets you hear the DX station in your left ear and hear all the people who are calling the DX station in your right ear. This makes it really easy for you to be able to hear the station that's being worked right now and then adjust your frequency to VFO B so that you can find that pattern and put yourself in a good spot to be heard. All right, that takes care of the Elecraft KX3. This brings us to the Yaesu FT817. Now, the Yaesu FT817 can transmit on VFO A or VFO B. The key thing to remember here, the trick, if you will, is that the frequency shown on the radio's display is the listening frequency. Whenever you're listening, it shows you the frequency on the display of where you're listening. As soon as you press the mic button, the display flips over to show you the frequency where you're transmitting. So this makes it kind of easy to make sure that you're not transmitting on the wrong frequency. Just make sure that you are not listening to the pileup when you transmit, or otherwise you're going to be engaging the microphone and transmitting on the DX station's frequency. All right, so let's talk about the buttons you have to press and how to do that. Let's look at it from the DX side first. So in this case, we're going to be listening on VFO A and transmitting on VFO B. There's no reason you have to do it this way. You could transmit on A and listen on B if you want to, but just to keep it simple, let's assume that we're listening on A and we're going to transmit on B. So I'm going to push the F button and rotate the selection knob till I see the menu entries A/B, A equals B, and SPL, which is split. Let's assume that we're already using VFO A. If not, set A equal to B by pressing A equals B, and then switch to VFO A. All right, so now we're using VFO A. Now let's push A equals B to set both VFOs to the same frequency. Now VFO B is set to the correct transmit frequency where everybody's listening for us. I'm going to push split, SPL, to go into split mode. Now I'm going to tune to the frequency where the calling stations will be transmitting. In other words, where I'm going to be listening. So now I'm listening on VFO A to where the calling stations will be found. And when I press the mic button, you'll see the display switches to VFO B, which is the original frequency, where we're transmitting. That's all there is to it. Just bear in mind that the frequency shown on the screen is where the pileup is, and when we key the mic, it's going to revert back to the original frequency where everybody else is listening for us. Okay, let's talk about the other side. If we're chasing DX, if we're part of the pileup, again, we're going to be listening on VFO A and transmitting on VFO B. So we're going to tune to the DX station on VFO A as normal. I'll push the F button and rotate the selection knob so I can see the menu entries A/B, A equals B, and split. I'm going to push A equals B to set both the VFOs to the same frequency. And now I'm going to push A/B to switch to VFO B. Remember, we're going to be transmitting on VFO-B. And because we're part of the pileup, we've got to move VFO-B to where the DX station is going to be listening. So now that I'm on VFO-B, I'm going to tune up to the frequency where the DX station said they're going to be listening, or where I hear the pileup. Now VFO-B is set for transmitting in the right spot. So I'm going to press the A/B to switch back to VFO-A. That's where we're going to be listening to the DX station. All right, now I'm going to press the split button to enter split mode. So now we're listening to VFO-A, but when we press the mic button, you'll see the display switches to VFO-B while we're transmitting. Now, to fine-tune where you transmit, you can press the A/B to switch to VFO-B and adjust your transmit frequency as desired. Just make sure to remember to press A/B to switch back to VFO-A when you're done. Remember, in split mode, whichever VFO and frequency is shown on the display is the frequency you're listening to. The other VFO, whose frequency is hidden, is the frequency that will be used when you transmit. All right, so that's about it for this video. I hope this has been helpful, and if you've been confused about working split, I hope this has brought some clarity to that. I'd like to urge you to go ahead and break out that radio manual, read the section about working split, practice working split, both from the DX perspective and from the pilot perspective. Practice makes perfect, and if you can become confident about setting your radio in split mode, you'll be prepared whenever the time comes to work split. Finally, if you have any questions for me about this or anything else, as always, just drop a question for me in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching, everybody.